election reportedly said to confidants, if we've lost Cronkite, we've lost the war, we've lost the country. And 1 month later, he leaves the race rather than suffer a defeat in the Wisconsin primary. And 4 days later, Martin Luther King is assassinated. 2 months after that, Robert Kennedy. I remember seeing Washington burn, going up in smoke. The 82nd Airborne having to come, probably the worst disruption, conflict in Washington since the War of 1812, flying into the city to restore order. America was in this incredible tumultuous period, unlike anything since the American Civil War. Richard Nixon wins election, promises Vietnamization, but the war goes on for 7 years, during which another 25,000 American servicemen and 8 women are killed. Their bodies brought home, and the images again and again shown on television. And so it was that loss of will in our political system, rightly, wrongly, whether we should have been there or not, that was the lesson that the Soviet strategists would take away from their involvement in Vietnam and from watching all this. They would see that the American system of free press and television and freedom of speech could undermine and counter America's military superiority in ordnance and armament. Now, fast forward to 1991, and this all comes together with the collapse of the Soviet Union. And I was a member of the U.S. Russia POW MIA Commission. I was in Moscow. I bumped into John Crystal coming out of the American Embassy. I said, John, hey. Ran over to see him. And there was actually a great deal of comedy between many Russian officials and the U.S. We were allowed into former Soviet prisons. We were given access to the entire archive of Soviet state security to look for information about any Americans who might have been held from World War II. They brought in the intelligence officers who had been in Vietnam. I remember them sitting there talking to me, and they said, you know, if we were you, we wouldn't believe you, us either, but we're telling you, here's the truth. And we had ways of checking, and they were telling us the truth about what they had done and hadn't done vis-a-vis American prisoners in Vietnam. But I also saw, when I went out in the streets, the incredible way that the Soviet military and Soviet society was now deflated as it had become Russia. And the economic activity that had been picked up in China and Vietnam was absent there. And here were former Soviet soldiers selling their medals on the street, trying to make a little money to buy food. And soon the U.S., through NATO expansion, would be, in their view, encroaching. And suddenly, Russia is confronting this situation, and Vladimir Putin and others to figure out what do we do. But the one place they were not missing, they were not depleted, was in the brain power of their strategic thinkers and planners. And so they turned back to look at that experience from Vietnam about the United States. And they saw in this, at the same time, that what was happening in America in 1992, 93, 94 was that the glue which had held together American society because of the existential threat the Soviet Union posed to the United States, that caused all Americans to suppress their own cultural, political, ideological beliefs, were now coming to the fore because there was a belief that now we had triumphed, we had won the Cold War, this was the peace dividend, and we no longer had to fear conflict with Russia, with the countries of the former Soviet Union. And so, it was in that achievement that American society begins to divide. And as that happens, abetted by cable news channels and with now advocacy on both sides of the political ledger, pushing on the issues most important to them, there are more and more ideological divisions popping up. Movements in the Congress, candidates picking certain vice presidents on that. And into this, then, the Russians saw their opportunity. And that was to do a concerted effort to use our freedom of speech, our free press, our internet, to join in the debate, to use those kind of arguments that would further divide Americans from each other. I had a small cameo role in all this when I was invited to go on RT television for an interview, Russian television. And I was going to be interviewed about food and agriculture issues. President of the World Food Prize Foundation. It sounded cool, RT, and people were talking about it, English language channel. So they have an office on K Street in Washington. And I amble over there, and there's a receptionist, and said, go back in here, and I went into this room, and I'm in the studio. And I'm all alone, and there's a chair, a voice says, sit down in the chair, please, and there's the camera, the light's going to come on, and suddenly there's a voice talking to me, this extremely engaging young Russian woman, speaking flawless English in Moscow, interviewing me about genetically modified crops and foods. And I'm kind of nonplussed by all of this because this, biotechnology, not been a big issue in Russia, not an issue at all. And no matter what I said, what question was asked, was coming back, arguing with me, disputing what I said, trying anything to get me to react in an overblown and divisive way. So, I was used to this and kind of laid back, and I wasn't taking the bait, but they got tired after a while and said thank you, and I didn't think anything more of it. Yesterday in the Des Moines Register, it's a whole story online about individuals from Iowa State and in the agriculture industry who have been trolled by all sorts of Russians, all on these same issues. So this is what they have been up to. This is what they have been seeking to do, to exacerbate these divisions that had come to the fore out of our victory in the Cold War in 1991. And now the debate is about the involvement in the presidential election. And it's, in sitting back and looking at this, so I've been an intelligence analyst. My embassy won, the only one to ever win 3 times in a row, the Director of Central Intelligence's award for exceptional reporting and analysis. So I like to think I've had some good experience in trying to put myself in the head and in the minds of those with whom we're dealing. And sitting there and trying to think of people sitting in Russia and do they really think they can do things to impact the outcome of the American election? And my guess, I don't know, I've not studied this, my guess is that looking at our country, they would have said, if you can manipulate elections, the Americans would have figured out how to do it long ago, and they'd be doing it. And the elections are so decentralized, so many places people are voting, so difficult to do, that I don't believe Russian strategists would think they could really do that. But what they could look to do, and what I think almost certainly they did do, is to try to put in place ideas that no matter what the outcome of the election would further exacerbate and break apart faith in the American political system. And I believe they saw the opportunity. So you can be sure, sitting in Moscow, they're reading all the polls, they're watching all the Morning Joe and CNN and Fox and Friends and trying to get what's the latest take, what's going to happen. And probably, and again, this is my speculation, probably came to the same general conclusion of many, many analysts, including many of my Republican friends in Iowa, that Senator Clinton was going to win the election and be president. And in that circumstance, did they want to put forward the ideas that could rile up the base of President Trump so that they would feel that the election was illegitimate? And if you look back at the themes that were around in October, I think that's what you find. That their expectation in Moscow would be that if we can have a sizable segment of the American electorate believe that the outcome of the election was illegitimate and a President Hillary Clinton was illegitimately elected, we will drive such a wedge into the American political system that it would be extremely difficult for Americans to unify again anytime should there be a conflict. That they could, using television, using images, using the internet, using ideas put forward by very eloquent, telegenic spokespersons on RT and other places, that they could offset American military capability. I don't know if that's the case, but in looking at and trying to understand what all of this information warfare is about, it seems to me that it's in this geostrategic assessment and planning that they would bring themselves to this. I've had a career looking at being involved in a number of areas. The World Food Prize is designed to be not only a reward for individuals who have promoted great achievements in increasing the quality, quantity, availability of food, but also for those who are endeavoring to build understanding and increased outreach in alleviating human suffering. In a divided America, I'm pleased that I can still get all of the Republicans and all of the Democrats in the state legislature to come together to honor our founder, Dr. Norman Borlaug, to feel great pride in our state's legacy of feeding hungry people, of having great heroes like Henry Wallace, Herbert Hoover, greatest humanitarian in the history of the United States of America, fed 600-700 million people, while working for a Democrat, for Woodrow Wilson, and then for Harry Truman. And so, my hope is that it is that common bond that still holds people together. That legacy of 350,000 people assembling in 1979 when Pope John Paul II was at Living History Farm. That come from around the world, more than 1,000 from 40 or 50 countries, to the World Food Prize. And so I endeavor